A feast of diversity. By comparing case studies, it is possible to learn whether the shift to agriculture always followed a single path. We will examine the origins of agriculture in 4 major areas. First, we'll stop in Africa, then New Guinea, then the Andes, and then finally East Asia over there near China. And we will understand the role of pastoralism and the timing for the introduction of pottery in Africa. We will understand the nature and significance of the archaeological site at Cook Swamp in New Guinea. We will also understand the relationship between the origin of village life and domestication in the Andes over there next to the Pacific Ocean. We will also understand the evidence from the 2 centers of domestication in China. And again, we're starting from around 11,000 years ago with Africa and New Guinea to around 6,000, 5,000 years ago with China, and around 3,000 years ago with the Andes. We're going to be investigating a lot of different sites. So this will be very interesting. A visit to the supermarket is also a trip around the world. In the produce section, we find corn and squash, plants domesticated in Mesoamerica. The bakery section is also filled with breads baked from wheat, domesticated in the Middle East. At the butcher, we will find the meat of cattle and pigs, as well as the occasional sheep and goat, also domesticated in the Middle East. And down the aisle, we will find sunflower seed oil, a crop first domesticated in eastern North America. And as we shall see and wander through the aisles, we will also come across such foods as potatoes, yams, rice, and coffee that also point to other centers of domestication. And so we will briefly examine 4 additional case studies in the origins of agriculture and our perspectives on agriculture. In Africa, pastoral societies based on domesticated animals developed without plant domestication. In New Guinea, domestication focused on plants that could be grown by transplanting suckers, cuttings, or shoots rather than by planting seeds. In the Andes, there is contrast between the domestication of plants and animals by mobile societies living in the highlands and that by village societies living on the coast, which depended heavily on marine resources. When agriculture was adopted on the coast, the main focus was a non-food. It was a non-food crop, and it was cotton. The early agricultural societies of China might yield the strongest support available for Gordon Childe, you remember him, and his concept of the origins of agriculture as a rapid and revolutionary event. However, this picture might be the result of limitations of the archaeological record rather than a reflection of the actual historical process. Resolving the question is an exciting and active area of research. When we broaden our focus, what emerges is a great deal of flexibility in the sequence of events leading to the shift from hunting and gathering to farming. And as we will fill our shopping carts in the supermarket, we are not only sampling the global diversity of agricultural crops, but we are also enjoying the fruits of a cornucopia of social transformation. And of course, we have Africa. The development of agriculture in Africa involved the indigenous domestication of plants and possibly animals, as well as the adoption of domesticated plants and animals from the Middle East. There are 3 major regions in Africa where plants were indigenously domesticated. In Ethiopia and Northeast Africa, a wide range of plants was domesticated, including grains such as teff and finger millet, which are essential to the local diet. A local domesticate that had a more global impact, however, is coffee. Unfortunately, the timing and process of the domestication of all of these plants are poorly understood. In Central Africa, 2 critical cereals, that of pearl millet and sorghum, were domesticated. It is most likely that pearl millet was first domesticated in the Sahara, but the location where sorghum was first domesticated is not known. In West Africa, there is African rice, or Oryza glaberrima, which was domesticated. And then, in addition to these indigenously domesticated plants, African agricultural systems incorporated domesticated plants introduced from the Middle East, including wheat, barley, and lentils. Among the domesticated animals introduced to Africa from the Middle East were sheep and goats. However, there is considerable debate over the origin of domesticated cattle on the continent. Although there is some genetic evidence supporting the argument that cattle were independently domesticated in Africa, the preponderance of evidence is that the animals were introduced from the Middle East. The Sahara Desert is the most dominant feature of the North African landscape today. The current arid environment in the Sahara developed only within the last 4,000 to 5,000 years. Between 14,000 and 4,500 years ago, there was considerable more rainfall in the Sahara, allowing for extensive human occupation, so around 1,400 years to 5,000 years ago. When we talk about villages and of hunter-gatherers during the period of increased rainfall in the Sahara, small villages of hunter-gatherers developed across northern Africa. The sites resemble the Natufian societies of the Middle East in several ways: their size, the nature of their structures, the exploitation of a wide range of resources, and the use of grinding stones. However, there was also significant differences between the African and the Natufian sites. The most striking difference is that pottery is commonly found on the African sites. In the Middle East, pottery was developed only during the late Neolithic. Another feature found on African sites is that is lacking from the Natufian sites is a large number of storage pits. Of course, one of the most complete pictures of an early village of hunter-gatherers in North Africa comes from excavations at Nabta Playa in the Egyptian Western Desert. This area is barren today, but when it was occupied, it was a small lake surrounded by grasslands. Site E75-6 was a village of 15 square or circular huts built in 2 rows that was occupied 9,000 years ago. Storage pits are found next to the remains of each structure. Pottery in the form of small jars with impressed designs is also present, although it is rare. A large range of plant remains have been recovered from this site, where the inhabitants focused particularly on the collection of wild sorghum. Excavations at the cave site of Uan Afuda in Libya have given a unique perspective on the pre-agricultural societies of the Sahara. Uan Afuda was occupied between 9,000 and 8,000 years ago. The spectacular preservation on the site has allowed the excavators to recover wooden artifacts, basketry, and a rich array of charcoal and seeds. The botanical remains at the site indicate that the people living there exploited a wide range of resources. One of the most interesting discoveries was a 10-centimeter deep bed of animal dung and plant remains found in the back of the cave. Analysis of the dung indicates that it is from wild Barbary sheep, a North African species that was never domesticated. The excavators argue that such an accumulation of dung does not form from sheep visiting a cave site. It appears that the early occupants of Uan Afuda were keeping wild sheep in a pen at the back of the cave. This discovery suggests that although these people had not domesticated sheep, they were practicing a form of animal management by capturing live animals and keeping them corralled in a cave. Excavations at the site of Gobero in the southern Sahara in Niger have uncovered a cemetery and associated evidence of habitation dating to 9,700 to 8,200 years ago. The site was located on a peninsula in a large lake, and fish appear to have made up a large part of the diet. Artifacts recovered include barbed bone points, bladets, and pottery. Due to an increasingly arid climate, the site was abandoned a little over 8,000 years ago. Again, we have the Sahara Desert, which is the most dominant feature of the North African landscape. Between 14,000 and 4,500 years ago, there was increased rainfall in the area, allowing for human occupation. In Nabta Playa, an area in the Egyptian Western Desert, was the location of a series of pre-agricultural and early agricultural sites located along the edge of a lake. Uan Afuda, a pre-agricultural site in the Sahara that yielded evidence that wild sheep were kept in pens in the back of a cave. And Gobero, a site in the Sahara alongside an ancient lake where a hunter-gatherer occupation dating to between 9,700 and 8,200 years ago has been discovered. Pastoralists. In much of North Africa, domesticated animals were introduced before domesticated plants. Domesticated cattle, sheep, and goats appear to have been incorporated into mobile hunter-gatherer societies. Mobile societies with an economy focused on maintaining herds of domesticated animals are known as pastoral societies. Based on excavations at Nabta Playa, Fred Windorf and his colleagues have argued that cattle might have been domesticated independently in Egypt as early as 10,000 years ago. His theory has not been widely accepted. However, it is clear that by 8,000 years ago, domesticated cattle, sheep, and goats had been introduced into societies that still did not exploit domesticated plants. Again, Site E75-8 at Nabta Playa has produced vivid evidence of the reliance on cattle roughly 7,500 years ago. At this site, a series of cattle burials was found under piles of stones known as tumuli. Recent excavations in the Fayum, where sediments were carefully screened in order to find small faunal remains, show that in the Nile Valley, fish were a major food resource alongside early domesticated animals. The earliest evidence of domesticated animals in the Central Sahara, at the site of Ouan Muhuyag, is dated to 7,000 years ago. As with Nabta Playa, there is no evidence of domesticated plants. The site at Gobero was reoccupied 72,000 years ago as climate conditions improved. By 6,000 years ago, the occupants added a small component of domesticated cattle to their subsistence base, although they continued to rely heavily on fishing. Concerning the first farmers, unfortunately, the development of village farming communities in Africa is poorly understood. In Egypt, the earliest evidence for domesticated plants dates to approximately 7,000 years ago. Wilma Wetterstrom has suggested that these resources were, at first, adopted by hunter-gatherers to provide a backup for brief periods of drought or low Nile floods. Once domesticated plants were introduced, large villages developed rapidly in the rich environment of the Nile Valley. And again, pastoral societies are mobile societies with an economy based on herds of domesticated animals. And so, in Western Africa, the earliest evidence of plant domestication is the imprint of domesticated millet grains found in the village sites of the Dar Tichet region of Mauritania, found around 3,500 years ago. Sorghum appears to have been introduced at a somewhat later date. And again, you can see rock art that's painted by the pastoralists in the Sahara that shows cattle being herded. You can also make observations about herd structure and social organization based on the image that has been produced. There is a great deal that we are still needing to learn in order to know about the origins of agriculture in Africa. However, even given the preliminary nature of the archaeological record, we can observe some interesting patterns. Pottery was introduced at the beginning of the sequence in Africa, whereas it is found only in the late Neolithic in the Middle East. Pastoral societies in Africa developed thousands of years before fully agricultural villages did. And in Africa, as in the Middle East, small villages predate the domestication of plants and animals. The evidence for a particular focus on wild sorghum at Nabta Playa and the penning of wild sheep at Ouan Afuda is particularly intriguing. And so we find out that, of course, pottery was introduced at the beginning of the sequence in Africa, where it's found only in the late Neolithic in the Middle East. Pastoral societies in Africa developed thousands of years before fully agricultural villages did. In Africa, as in the Middle East, small villages predate the domestication of plants and animals. And this is all very interesting. Next, we will talk about New Guinea. And then we will cover the Andes before moving on to Eastern China, or East Asia, which is China.